I want to talk a little bit about the tragedy of Mike Pence and Joe Biden today, because it illustrates something important about how when we're judged at the end of the day, we don't take all the little things and add them up and put like, well, check one here, minus one there. We get judged on the big things, and we don't get judged on our intentions. That's a little chastening. First, take Mike Pence. For 4 years, he did nothing but enable Donald Trump. He ran cover on Trump's handling of the COVID pandemic. He wrote that ridiculous op-ed trying to pretend that there would be no second wave of COVID, which he must have known at the time wasn't true. During the campaign in 2020, Pence even went so far as to play footsie with Trump's pre-election election denialism when he was asked in the vice presidential debate with Kamala Harris whether or not Trump should commit to the peaceful transfer of power, which again, Trump had refused to do. Pence qualified it, and he said, if it's a free and fair election, then they would commit to the peaceful transfer of power. This is really bad, really irresponsible. He tried to pretend there was Democrats who had spent 4 years trying to overthrow the government, which just wasn't true. It was flat out a lie. And yet, on January 6th, Donald Trump asked Mike Pence to validate his coup. The idea, if you think back and you remember, Trump is down at the Ellipse and he is making his big speech on the Mall, and he's calling on Mike Pence to refuse to certify the electoral vote count. We've got this enormous mob of thousands of people. Trump knows that there are people in that mob carrying weapons. We know this from the testimony we get during the January 6th committee. Trump directs this mob to walk down onto the Capitol, this armed mob, and he tells them that they've got to take the country back with strength. Now, this mob goes and storms the Capitol. Their express purpose is to prevent the certification of the electoral votes. And they are saying, chanting verbally out loud, that they are there to hang Mike Pence. In this moment, Mike Pence, the guy who spent 4 years covering for Trump, excusing Trump, enabling Trump, that Mike Pence is the only guy who can stop Trump's coup. If Pence goes along with what Trump wants, because he's afraid, or because he's afraid that because he's got family members with him in the Capitol at the time, then who knows what happens or where we wind up. So Pence gets put in a secure location there, and the Secret Service wants to take him out of the building. They're trying to get him into their car, and Pence refuses. In this moment, Mike Pence becomes the guy who is the singular focal point, the bulwark for the entire American democratic project. He refuses to get into the car with the Secret Service. He refuses to leave the Capitol. He gets on the phone with Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer and Mitch McConnell and insists and works with them to get the certification of the electoral votes done as quickly as possible. He's doing this again under immediate and intense physical threats to himself and his family, and to the career threat to his life as a politician. He knows that after this, it's over. And he does it anyway. It's really something. Compare that with Joe Biden. Joe Biden gets elected president. He comes into this absolute shit show. The COVID pandemic is still raging. We've got the COVID vaccine, but the Trump administration has absolutely screwed up the rollout of the vaccine. And Biden has one of the most successful terms of any president of the modern era. If you go back and you rank the last 15 or 16 four-year presidential terms, I think you'd be hard-pressed to put Biden anywhere outside of the top 5. He might even be in the top 3. What does Biden do? Well, he fixes the rollout of the COVID vaccine and absolutely crushes the pandemic. People forget this now. We think the pandemic is happening a decade ago. The pandemic was a live issue when Biden came into office. And he made it so that we don't even have to think about COVID anymore. He hustles through Congress an absolutely silly amount of meaningful legislation, much of it with very broad bipartisan support. The infrastructure bill, the Inflation Reduction Act, The CHIPS Act, gun control reform, the first gun control reform legislation signed in a generation, the Respect for Marriage Act, the reform of the Electoral Vote Count Act, the Fiscal Responsibility Act. It goes on and on. He caps insulin prices. He keeps unemployment at or below 4% for almost the entirety of his term. And then, when post-pandemic inflation hits America, as it does pretty much the entire industrialized world, Biden whips inflation over the course of a single year. And by the end of 2022, we are out of America's inflationary period. Then, on top of that, he manages the first great power war in Europe since World War II, as well as any American president has handled any foreign policy crisis in the post-war period. Now, look, Joe Biden made plenty of mistakes too, right? But every presidential administration has mistakes. There's no such thing as a perfect presidential administration. And when you add it all up, Biden looks like a very wise, very good president. Except for that one last thing. Because Biden is there at the helm when Donald Trump returns to power and his Trumpified, MAGAfied Republican Party takes total control of the federal government. There's something really here. Do you see it? Mike Pence spends 4 years covering for Trump, yet at the final moment, he's the one who defeats Trump's coup. And Joe Biden spends 4 years being a very wise president and opposing Trumpism. And yet, he's the guy who just stands there as the transitionary period between these two authoritarian attempts. This is an American tragedy, a uniquely American tragedy. It's the kind of thing we all ought to think about, because these are the sorts of things that can happen when history has its eye on you.